Are the ideological tides turning in California with the recall election on Governor Gavin Newsom? And do you really want your schools to woke your kids? These are questions that we'll talk about today on this episode of The Independent Outlook. Greetings, everybody. I'm Graham Walker, coming to you from the Independent Institute here in Oakland, California, right across the bay from San Francisco. And we aim to bring you something of an independent outlook on the issues and news of the day. And I'm delighted to be joined in this conversation to have with me my colleague, David Theroux, president of the Independent Institute. Hey, David.
Hello.
Glad you're here. Also, we have Williamson Evers, Dr. Bill Evers, who is the director of our Center on Educational Excellence. Welcome, Bill.
Thank you.
So glad to have you. I'm just wondering, can you guys make a comment on what's happening in California with the recall of Governor Newsom? I mean, I noticed that just apparently 2 days ago, the California Secretary of State's office told us that they had confirmed the number of signatures required to have the recall proceed. There are some details yet. They have until April 29 for some counties, which is say tomorrow, some counties to submit the rest of their signatures. Then there's a 30-day period in which people can withdraw their signatures. There's an effort launched by a former state senator called Stop the Steal. And I wonder whether this thing bodes some kind of serious ideological shift in California or whether it's just kind of a passing fad. What do you guys think?
Well, I would suggest it's not a passing fad. It's very significant. Newsom is a horrible governor. He's responsible for many of the state's ills and will not do anything to address other state ills. And his response to the recall is that this will, well, I'll quote from him. He says, "This threatens our values. From fighting COVID to helping struggling families, protecting our environment, and passing common sense gun violence solutions." And who does he believe is behind the recall effort? Why, it's anti-vaccine people. It's QAnon extremists.
Mm-hmm.
It's violent white supremacists who attacked our nation's capital. It couldn't be just average people, including independents and Democrats, who don't like the wildfires, who don't like the fact the schools are closed, who don't like, you name it, the high taxes, the exodus of businesses.
Sounds like Governor Newsom wants to blame it all on that guy with horns and the fur in the Capitol.
Well, Newsom wants to be president, and he's had his career shoehorned by influential people. And people cannot deal with the problems that are being caused by this one-party state that believes that government is the solution to everything.
I think, there just aren't that many very, very right-wing people in the state of California sufficient to sign all these petitions. So there has to be a much larger base of discontent with Governor Newsom.
I would think so. You know what? I've actually got the printout from the Secretary of State's office here, and guess which county has the largest number of signatures to recall Gavin Newsom? Can you imagine? It's Los Angeles.
Well, that's where the people are too.
Yes, where the people are too. But in other words, it's not some weird little corner of the state.
Right.
All over the state.
I just think, and right now, the polling data shows that he would win, but also people are vulnerable when they hold a position like the governorship, and he's already shown from his infamous dinner in Napa County with indoors at a time when it was not supposed to be policy that people would eat without masks and eat indoors. So he's capable of alienating people and maybe losing it. But right now, another problem is that there are multiple Republicans in the race. And it'd be easier if one of them was really outstanding in terms of name recognition, in terms of civic stature, in terms of experience in something like the governorship. It doesn't have to be the governorship, but something of a similar managerial, executive sort of situation.
Trouble is you want both name recognition and civic stature, not one or the other, right?
Well, I'm just saying the ideal candidate would be one that matches those. So why don't you name the candidates, Graham, and David and I can have maybe conflicting views on who has the best chance.
That'll be fun. That'll be fun. Well, okay, so the previous contender who ran against Governor Newsom before he was governor, John Cox. Then there's Kevin Faulconer.
Well, why don't you just pause after each one?
Okay, pause. John Cox. What about John Cox? Can he do it?
I don't think so. I had some dealings with him in the last campaign. He's a perfectly nice guy, but he didn't have either the name recognition or the stature.
Okay, what do you think, David? John Cox, make it or not make it?
There's no way.
Yeah, he was too far behind last time. It just didn't get traction. He didn't seem to make the case that he could have made.
He didn't make the case. His handlers basically buried all the issues, and so he was just lost.
Okay, Kevin Faulconer, former mayor of San Diego, pretty prominent. I mean, he's got that California thing that supposedly Californians like to be socially liberal and fiscally conservative. That's what they say about Faulconer. Could he pull it off, Bill?
Well, I think he might be able to. I mean, he matches the state. He matches the kind of Republican that can win statewide in California, or at least used to be able to. One of his problems is that Cox is sending out very effective mailers attacking him from the right. So that hurts him. He doesn't have much name recognition outside of San Diego. But he has sufficient civic stature and experience in an executive position. Running San Diego is similar to what it would take to be a good governor. Yeah. And he's been a good mayor of San Diego. But he may not be conservative enough to mobilize grassroots support for him, and yet he may be too conservative for California. So
it's a tightrope.
On my own issue of education, he's pretty good.
You know, but the thing is that the way this works is that there are two questions on the ballot. One is recall or not recall Governor Newsom. If 51% say recall, then question two is which of the following, and it only takes the plurality in the which of the following.
So whoever is the most, right?
Yes.
You don't need a majority to win the governorship. You just need a majority to oust the current governor.
Right.
So now, we should go to Caitlyn Jenner.
Okay, so there you've got name recognition, but without civic stature.
Right. And his politics are pretty good. He's probably conservative enough to get some grassroots support. The only question is he going to be treated seriously enough?
Right. I don't think he will be.
And every voter is going to have to think through, do I say she or do I say he? This is so confusing. It raises
It's a distraction. It's a distraction for people because, look, they're confronted with all this cultural left stuff, you know, transgender bathrooms and you name it, right? And so one of the things that a lot of the state is recoiling from is this basically anti-family, anti-bourgeois values, anti-capitalist, et cetera, et cetera. Now, he doesn't fall into the latter, but he doesn't fit the profile of what I think the average Black or Hispanic parents want as a role model for their kids.
Right, that's the trouble.
And that's the reality of it. So I just don't think the packaging of him is. So if they have if
only Faulconer had been an Olympic athlete, right?
Maybe, but I think that if the recall goes through, I suspect it will. Go yes, because there's going to be a lot of focus on the failures of Newsom, and the schools are at the time of the election, it's the issue of the schools. There's going to be the possibility of wildfires again. True. The water shortage. And
water and fires are, yes, but I am thinking that schools are going to, and power, but I'm thinking And that, of course, was a big problem for Governor Gray Davis,
Yes.
power and wildfires. But I think the schools, even though they did this, they completely messed up with the schools for the past year when they should have been open, they've had them closed. Not unique to California, so that will be helpful to them. But they'll probably have the students back in the classroom by the fall, and they're going to have that election in the fall because they have to go through this, your right to take your name off, and then they have a study where they study the costs and blah, blah, blah. So in the past, the Democrats have tried to make it coincide with the general election or get it as close to the general election as possible so they can get the most turnout, because that's where the Democrats think they're advantaged.
Right.
So I think not only that, he's going to have an incentive to get the schools open. I mean, he's he's kind of been trying in a half-assed way to do it. He just hasn't been standing up to the unions enough.
I don't think he's going to stand up to the unions enough. And so I think a lot of the schools will stay closed. They'll only be partially open.
Right.
Anyway, my suspicion is that
if that's the case, I agree with David that he will lose.
Right. So if he loses, and whoever, Cox, Faulconer, Jenner, whoever else is on the ballot, it'll be the plurality, and that's it.
Yeah, it's actually, at that point, it's a relatively easy threshold. I mean, one thing that could happen, if a single prominent Democrat decided to get on, that would affect the vote on question 1.
Right, and Republicans could split their own vote.
Yeah,
that's right. That's right.
Very interesting.
That could easily happen. But
so far, no Democrat wants to, challenge Governor Newsom.
No,
it's interesting too that California now has the lowest infection rate on COVID of the 50 states. So that's going to help Governor Newsom. Also, going back to Caitlyn Jenner, I was rather struck. I mean, I'm not a Caitlyn Jenner supporter, but I was struck by the fact that Caitlyn's reaction to the thing on The View last week was very interesting. Apparently, one of the guests, the host rather, on The View, I think it was Joy.
It was Joy.
Was guilty of misgendering. Said he at one point instead of she, and of course it's very confusing. But Caitlyn's response to that a couple of days ago was actually pretty admirable. Caitlyn said, "Don't worry about it. I'm not into cancel culture." Well, good. I'm glad. I'm glad that Caitlyn.
He's also said California's got a lot more problems than a few people having problems with pronouns.
That's right.
Okay. That was admirable. You know what I mean?
That's right.
I agree. He handled that very deftly.
Mm-hmm.
Yep.
But the governor, whatever. But then going back to something you said at the beginning of this section, David, before we move on, you quoted Governor Newsom, who tweeted out on Monday that statement you read to us. I found that the most intriguing phrase that Governor Newsom used was "our values." He said, "This recall threatens our values." Now, he didn't go into what those values meant, but this strikes me as very much a reflection of how times have changed. Politicians who invoked values used to be on the so-called right wing of things. I remember all the conservative, values voters events and so forth. Well, the orbit has turned a bit here, and so now it looks to me as if Governor Newsom actually is trying to use that whole values thing as a kind of a wedge issue to gain a culture war advantage in California against the Republicans. It's a very interesting turn of events.
But I think it's really the woke culture, and so we shouldn't. The values there. It's kind of an interesting attempt at a segue, but I don't think it's going to really work for him. But we should be concerned about the woke culture and neo-racism, and
we should. Yeah, David. One last comment.
And so forth.
Did you have a last comment on the governor stuff, David?
Well, the Democrats still have not learned about the issue of guns.
Right.
Because in many of the cities in California, it's legal to shoplift, it's legal to smash and break into cars, and there's no penalty.
Well, no, it's not that it's illegal; it's just there's no penalty.
Well, essentially saying there's no offense. You're not going to be arrested.
It's still illegal, but they don't put you in jail. They don't prosecute you.
No, and there's no record. So that if anything makes something illegal, I think those factors would make it. But anyway, the point is that people are concerned about crime. They're concerned about their person. The riots didn't help any, of course, and the fact that Newsom and the Democrats continue to believe that disarming people who are law-abiding and not committing crimes is the way to reduce crime rates is just astoundingly stupid. It's stupid as far as the evidence about the issue, and it's incredibly stupid politically. So, but Newsom, has his constituents, and he has to play to them. So that's why he basically made the statement that he did.
Let me just pause for a second and remind all of our participants and viewers that if you're viewing us, as many of you are, I think, through thinkspot.com, we welcome you, and you can submit your questions or comments through the chat box or the Q&A, and they'll get to me, and we'll try and take some of your questions and comments. Turning the page, gentlemen, to a not totally unrelated subject. We're talking about schools, and woking your kids is my issue here next. I was intrigued to notice that the New York Post has done a pretty deep dive on what's going on among New York City schools, especially the posh private schools in New York, like the Heschel School, the Beerley School, the Riverdale Country School, Dalton School, Collegiate School. All these schools are now engaging in a curricular effort to teach critical race theory, and parents are getting uncomfortable. This one guy, let's see, he's in the Post article, Harvey Goldman, has a 9-year-old daughter who's been harangued about how she possesses white privilege. And he says that this is child abuse, not education. That's what this parent says of a 9-year-old girl in a New York City school. This is not unique to New York City, nor unique to the private schools. It's also in the public schools. What are we to make of this? I mean, how can this kind of hectoring indoctrination, Bill Evers, you're an expert on this, how can this be so unfettered in the curriculum in both public and private schools?
Well, as E.D. Hirsch noted many, many years ago, the culture that the teachers and the school administrators have is shared across the public and private schools. Now, you can get situations where the Catholic schools or the non-denominational private schools are more traditionalist, either in culture or in educational teaching methods, but they're often pretty similar. So Brearley is a great girls' school. When I was of high school age, it was, if not the most serious academic school for girls in New York City, private school. It was certainly one of the few that was really top. And Dalton was the premier progressive school. It was coeducational. And, these were top schools in terms of academic seriousness, the college preparation that was offered, and so forth. But they have been infected with these ideas, this neo-racism that comes with critical race theory, and the parents don't know why they have to be paying these tens of thousands of dollars and fight to get in. I mean, to get admitted to these schools is harder than getting into Stanford or Princeton.
And you pay $50,000 plus a year.
You pay a huge amount. And not only that, you have to start in preschool. In other words, these people are fighting to get into nursery school, and then they're fighting to get into private elementary schools, and then they're fighting to get into the high schools. And so the parents feel, why should I pay for this indoctrination? Why should I pay for this trash? It's not even academically sound. It's not real history. It's not real examination of civilization. It's just these beliefs, these political beliefs that are kind of horrible. Many of these people are Jewish, and they don't like racially based political views. They want universal values. They like universal values.
There's this one parent listed or cited in the
another thing. Many Asian parents do not like the prejudice that seems to be sweeping the elite classes in New York of closing down Asian admissions to Bronx School of Science, to Peter Stuyvesant, and so forth. These selective exam-based public schools, they're trying to block Asians from coming in based on their merits.
Right.
So that's part of it. You have a lot of Asians who also favor universal application of merit, and I think they're admirable in this. But it's just all kinds of people.
I think it's coming, not only what Bill is saying, but it's coming from really sort of the collapsing of progressive theory. Progressives have believed that they were at the cutting edge of protecting people from abuse and exploitation and inequality and so forth. And they've had a record now of spending trillions and trillions of dollars, and the outcome of this has either had no difference or it's made things far worse. And instead of giving up their ideology, they have opted for this critical race theory. And so, someone like Ibram X. Kendi, who's sort of the high priest of wokeism, is now embraced. And his view basically is that if there's any differences in, say, standardized tests, it's because of racism. If there's any difference
all differences, all disparate outcomes,
disparate outcomes, exactly,
are supposedly caused by implicit or explicit racism. And of course, Thomas Sowell has written a great book, book length, short book, but a book on this topic that shows this is baloney.
Yeah, the book is Discrimination and Disparities.
Right. So if there are lots of Mohawk Indians in the high skyscraper construction industry, it's not because people are in favor of Mohawk Indians or against Mohawk Indians. It's just the way it is.
Right. And so what this comes down to is this ideology is it's a binary, it's sort of a Manichaean concept. Manichaean meaning there's two opposite groups. And in this case, it's progressive versus bigot, okay? So if there's any disparity in the outcome, if someone is a better basketball player or a computer programmer or makes more money at a hair salon, the only explanation can be racism, because they're essentially, they don't want to admit, essentially, that progressivism is at fault. And
right.
so
they turn to this as an excuse. That's right.
They've turned to it as an excuse. And someone like Kendi, who is essentially exalted in this respect, and it's not just in the schools. It's in big tech. It's in the corporate world. It's in policymaking. And if you don't comply, let's say you're a teacher at any of the schools you mentioned in New York, and this article talks about some of them, and if you criticize it, you are racist. You're a racist and need to be not just canceled but eliminated. So it's a totally intolerant view, and it's quite frankly an extremely racist view. So Asians who are performing better at Harvard are racist because they have white privilege. And they've essentially caved to the white establishment, and hence they're part of the bigotry.
They're adjacent whites.
Right, they're adjacent whites.
Light conditionals. So there's some interesting sidebars to this. So we were just talking about Asians. So Congress just passed a law trying to protect Asians from hate and discrimination and various things. But they left out one thing. They left out higher education. So we know that right now that selective universities and colleges are engaging in practices where they are not admitting Asian Americans based on their merits, and they're having, in fact, quotas for them. So they let the colleges and universities off the hook. They can't, and this also can apply to hiring. So let's say there's a faculty position or some kind of research position or whatever. If they are in practice discriminating against Asian Americans, the universities are exempt from this. Now, that's not true for other racial groups, but so they're Congress, and this is the Democrats, the Republicans all voted to say colleges shouldn't be doing stuff against Asian Americans, and all the Democrats voted that no, colleges can't be, they get a pass, we're going to condone their. So then another thing, so one of
Wait a minute, so hold on, I'm not sure I understand that. So that means that the bill is supposed to stop Asian hate in every domain except higher education.
That's right.
Right.
And the Democratic majority.
No, not the majority. All the Democrats.
All the Democrats.
All the Democrats, yeah. Wow.
So anyway, so there's that. So here's another symptom of wokeness. So the state of Virginia, which used to have some of the finest academic content standards in the country, the so-called Virginia Standards of Learning, has just decided it's going to eliminate advanced math tracks except for in the 11th and 12th grades. So what used to be the case, and this is, depending on the school and the school district and so forth, but in a younger grade, like freshman year of high school or 8th grade or something like that, they might start saying, okay, kids, some of you seem to be pretty good at math and we can get you to calculus, maybe BC calculus by your senior year in high school, or maybe even something more advanced than that. So we're going to start you doing up to your capacity at a younger grade. They're going to disallow that. The only time that they're going to allow you to go faster, if you're able, is in 11th and 12th grades. Well, that's not really that easy to get into calculus if you only have those years. Mm-hmm. You need more than one. So your senior year, the 12th grade, would be one of those calculus grades. But you can't get everything before calculus if you only have that extra advanced work in 11th grade in your junior year. So this is a very counterproductive egalitarianism. And we know, and this research has been summarized by Tom Lovelace, who's retired recently from the Brookings Institution, but he shows that at every level. So first of all, it's easier for a teacher to teach a math class if there are narrower bands of how well a student's doing in that subject. So if you're not having to teach all levels of competence in your class and you can have a narrower band, it's easier. And it helps the people at all the different ends. So the lower kids do better when they're not in with the higher kids and so forth. So you add additional comprehension, additional learning if you separate this out. Now there's some disputes about all this, but essentially that's the case. So, but for ideological reasons, they want to hurt student learning. And as another example of this, so this is at the highest level.
You're full of examples here. It's just like
I got one more.
Okay, yeah, but I mean the point. There's so many examples because there really is quite an avalanche. But keep going.
So when you apply for a federal grant, you fill out all these forms and you have these questionnaires and on and on and on, and they assign points, the evaluators of who's going to get the grant. They give points for various things. So they might, any number of things could be in there. Maybe the qualifications of the grant administrator, had they done something like this before, and how needy were the people that were going to benefit, and all these sort of things. So one of the big things is they're going to add points if you're going to foster critical race theory or culturally sensitive learning or whatever nickname you want to call it. It amounts to this neo-racist curriculum. So the federal government is going to sway grants, channel grants to the perpetrators, the proponents, the advocates of this indoctrination. I think this is really, really horrifying.
That's what Biden is pushing.
They've done it. They've put it in the rules.
Right. And so they have this program called the Civic Secures Democracy Act.
That's a separate
I know,
horrible
but
thing.
I'm just saying it's all part of this. Graham, another example is now in this case, it's for history and civics education programs. And they're going to deliberately discriminate based on race, ethnic, and linguistic achievement. And it is, well, this and the other things we've been talking about are increasingly being targeted for lawsuits based on the 14th Amendment
Right.
and the Civil Rights Act and so on and so forth.
So
But
the woke
literally,
stuff.
in the name of anti-racism, essentially what they're doing is institutionalizing racism in a draconian way.
I want to add something to what David said about this fostering civics bill that's in front of Congress. So a lot of people look at this, including people we know, and they think, great, our kids don't know enough about civics. Let's have the federal government interfere with civics education across the United States, and it will be better. People will understand the three branches of government and how a bill becomes law and all this stuff. No, that's not what this is going to be. This is going to be like culturally sensitive civics in Illinois. That's what it's going to be. It's going to be bad. So let's say you're some kind of constitutionalist conservative or civil liberties liberal or something like this, and you think that's what they're going to get. No, they're going to get this political correctness, woke indoctrination in the name of civics. It's a very bad idea.
I think the lawsuits could make a dent in the momentum here, because
it's hard for the lawsuits to challenge this civics thing.
Yeah, it is.
The judges generally defer to the curriculum decisions of the school system. So,
right.
They shouldn't have passed this law. They should not.
I just got this great question from one of our participants today, one of our viewers, who says, where does the mass adoption of critical race theory in American schools lead? Does it lead to inevitable implosion of the schools or rampant dominance across all institutions? Where do you guys see this going?
Cultural acceptance over the last 5 years of critical race theory is really breathtaking. But I think it's essentially, as I said before, a reflection of the collapse of progressivism. On the one hand, progressivism is an abject failure, and they have no explanation of why things have not gotten better for inner city blacks and the family and what have you. Educational performance and so forth. The other part of it,
rather than open up jobs by getting rid of job licenses,
right,
or getting competition between schools, or getting incentives that improve work by principals and teachers, they don't want to do that because the labor unions are against that. So instead, they're going to push this: every white is a domineering racist, and that's going to be the explanation instead of failed liberal policies.
One of the great ironies is, if there's anything that you could call systemic racism, it's progressive policies that have essentially locked people into marginal or sub-marginal categories in which they have no way out, in the schools, in employment,
in housing,
and so on and so forth. But if your goal is equity, and you believe that any sort of disparity is a reflection of racism, then you're going to buy into this. And of course, it's just going to make everything far worse.
So the questioner is asking, is this going to hit a brick wall, or is it going to take over everything?
It's interesting. Bret Stephens, who's a columnist in the New York Times, quite influential. He's what amounts to a conservative as far as the New York Times is concerned. Had a very interesting column, and he said there's going to be a crack up. There's too many people that like the ideals of the Declaration of Independence and the Constitution, and people succeeding on their merits and an open society. And if you keep trying to tell them that they have to analyze everything through a racist lens, they're going to rebel. And all these stories that we've been talking about in all these private schools in New York, these are the people whose parents in these schools, they are the decision makers of America. Mm-hmm. And if they are getting fed up with this, there's going to be a crack up. It's coming obviously from the working class, because that's how a major factor in how Trump got elected in the first place. So if it's coming from both ends, it's going to be a crack up.
It's going to be a crack up. And the other part of this is The fact that progressives, it's like the old definition of a conservative is a liberal who is mugged. And
mugged by reality, as they
mugged
say.
by reality, and I think that's a lot of what we're going to see more and more. I think that's why Trump picked up increasing numbers of blacks and Hispanics and others who voted for him in 2000, this last election, but the woke crowd, it's a religion, right? And they don't want to give that up.
It has the passions of a religion,
right? And so they're fearful that they will not be able to maintain power, and so they want to ratchet their control so no one can ever dispute them again.
It's interesting. Remember, we had a big conservative and to some extent libertarian spurt after a previous effort at cultural progressivism. So if you think about it, where did the neoconservatives come from? They came partly in reaction to racial quotas and anti-Jewish sentiment of an earlier time period. So we know also 2 Yale researchers have just done a study saying that the Democratic Party is not going to succeed by pushing this racial lens. If they want to have various kinds of programs that in their opinion help people, in our opinion probably don't, they'll be much more successful at pushing them if they stop pounding on this everybody's a racist theory. So this is like a detailed high-class social science study. And then another straw in the wind is James Carville. He just gave a speech, actually it was an interview with Vox, and he said, look, this woke thing is hurting the Democratic Party.
Carville's a weather vane. He's always been a weather vane.
He is a master of rhetoric and how to mobilize people and what kinds of things are going to set people off. And he's pretty smart at that. We don't have to agree with him, but I think, he's warning them that they're going, just as McGovern and all that stuff went off the cliff, these guys are going off the cliff unless they stop and figure out a better, more effective way to try and sell their programs.
Okay, here's a couple more examples of reaction, which may prevent the overwhelming dominance of this woke theory, and that is that apparently over the last, was it 2 years here? Yeah, the proportion of Black Americans, or students, African American students in homeschooling increased from 3.3% in the spring of 2020 to 16.1% in the fall of 2020.
Huge.
It's a huge shift. And here's another little evidence. Day before yesterday, the legislature of the state of Idaho passed a new bill, which is about to be signed apparently by the governor, which says it bars the schools in Idaho from
both K-12 and higher education.
Yeah. They won't be able to force students into belief systems that claim that groups defined by sex, race, ethnicity, and religion are inferior or superior to others. And in particular, I love the language in this. It said that they cannot make students affirm, adopt, or adhere to belief systems claiming that people of any race, sex, ethnicity, or religion or national origin are responsible for past actions by people of the same group. Every individual says the sponsor should be treated equally under the law, and no one should be compelled to believe something just because someone else does. I mean, Americans, they want that. That's what Americans believe in.
And I think
that doesn't mean you couldn't teach a bit about this thought.
Oh, yeah, you can.
Just as when you're discussing the Civil War,
right,
you could say, well, why did the Confederates believe this? The Union people believe that.
Right.
You're not compelling the student to agree with the beliefs of these people. So they can teach something about this, but they can't put the people in the position where they're coerced into adopting in order to get a grade, in order to graduate, in order to pass on to the next class. They can't be fostering this. They can't be indoctrinating in this. Now, some people say, oh, this is a free speech problem of some sort for the teachers. No, it's not.
Not from the podium.
That's right. You're hired by this, in a private school, you're hired by the private school. In a public school, you're hired by the state government, and the state government can decide what the curriculum is. And the courts have already looked into all this. Now the teacher can say stuff, you know, at home, at a club,
Yeah,
on
online,
the radio, whatever.
Mm-hmm.
And by the way, whether the students can say things away from school is going to come before the Supreme Court. But anyway, the thing is, there's several states that have bills like this pending, and we'll just see what happens.
Did you notice the news came out that our new education secretary, Miguel Cardona, wrote emails back when he was head of education in Connecticut, urging all the school districts and so forth to make sure they promoted teachers who were behind the woke agenda. He used that literally. Yes. That was his.
He was particularly concerned. They have a Connecticut Teacher of the Year. Every state has a Teacher of the Year, and there's a National Teacher of the Year also in the United States. And so they had a advisory panel to promote their critical race theory curriculum. And so he wanted this Teacher of the Year who had a history of backing the same sort of stuff on this panel, because he was worried about the acceptance by teachers of this neo-racist curriculum. I have to think, you know, they could have picked a worse Secretary of Education. I'm not saying he's the worst, but I'm saying that on this issue, he seems to be a conformist or adherent of this critical
stunning.
Race theory curriculum. So
okay, so I don't want them.
That.
I don't want them to woke my kids. I don't think I want them to woke my tech either. I noticed this interesting news came out that philanthropists who are connected to Facebook, Twitter, and Netflix have donated more than $7.5 million to a host of nonprofits that are controlled by Patrice Cancuilors, who is the self-avowed Marxist founder of Black Lives Matter. So,
it's also fascinating. Not only have they given this money to her, which either we know something about where it was spent, and not very much in terms of public education, whatever, but on houses and other things. But in turn, she has lobbied for net neutrality. So neutrality,
this sounds like a quid pro quo to me.
It's certainly an amazing coincidence. So net neutrality, we should think about it this way. So think about highways and things like that. So that's kind of what broadband is. And think about toll lanes and various faster and high occupancy vehicle lanes and so forth. Okay, so on the broadband, the internet service providers, who are ISP, abbreviated a lot of the time, are one set of people, and they're like the highway owners and managers, and the big tech companies like Google and Netflix and so forth are the trucking companies. They are lots and lots of stuff that they want to get over there. So instead of allowing the highway owners, the broadband owners, to have differential pricing and try to use price to balance out the flow across the internet. So it's like charging higher prices to go into downtown Singapore at certain times of the day, which they do in Singapore. So you try and spread the traffic so people that don't have to be there in a high peak time come in later, come in at night or something like that. So anyway, they're trying to have net neutrality. It was an Obama proposal, and then the Trump people got rid of it. And now they're going to, try and stack the FCC and other things, and the big tech companies that want this thing. It sounds extremely attractive, net neutrality, but it really is interference with property.
Right.
And
so she's lobbying to get what those tech companies want.
The ones that are paying her all this money.
Millions and millions of dollars. Wow.
Exactly. And the
lending the virtue of Black Lives Matter to this extraneous cause, which really has nothing to do with Black Lives Matter.
And the idea is to give cover to her having influence. And the big tech companies want to maintain the sort of tragedy of the commons situation. without having an efficient pricing system for peak hours and peak use. And,
Exactly.
and
They think they can do. So I have to say, as long as we're bashing big tech, I want to say one thing. So I knew Reed Hastings somewhat some decades ago, and
Reed Hastings is
Netflix, and he was on the State Board of Education in California, and he quite heroically stood up. So some Latino politicians wanted to have a thing where there would be separate academic channels for white people and Latinos. I know that sounds crazy. You can't even imagine that somebody would want that, except that some ethnic studies stuff is sort of similar thing, a cousin of that. But they wanted that. And Hastings said, I'm not going to support that. That's bad for the Latinos, and it's bad for the state of California. And of course, they forced him out of so the guy is capable of doing the right thing. I wish he would do it on some other issues.
The problem with virtually all these tech gurus is they went to Stanford and Harvard and other elite schools, and
I might add too,
right, and
just throw
Berkeley
that
and
in.
UCLA, and the elite culture is progressivism, and when push comes to shove, they default to that, and that's what their friends think. So they think that's the moral standard.
Well, they think it's the moral standard because everybody at their cocktail parties thinks it's the moral standard.
And they don't understand why there are disparities between blacks and non-blacks. And there are very real reasons why there are disparities. And it has to do with government programs that keep blacks down.
As long as I'm giving some friendly statements about Reed Hastings and some of the other people in these high-tech circles, they've been pretty good about supporting charter schools. I ought to give them credit there too.
That is good. Hey, and just on the schools thing, before I change the subject once again, all is not lost on schools because of the reaction we talked about, but also partly because there are things that people can do. So, for example, the Independent Institute has just published this book called Really Good Schools, Global Lessons for High Caliber, Low Cost Education, which is very much worth taking a look at. We just published it, I guess, last week before. And the book shows, through the work of researcher James Tooley from the UK, how there is a vast revolution going on under the radar screen in the poorer countries of the global south, where parents are banding together, creating little mini private schools that are ultra inexpensive and ultra effective, and getting them out from under the governmental monopolies, which are even worse in those countries than they are here. Hope for the future coming to us from those who are actually leading the way in the global south. You ought to check out Really Good Schools.
It's not unlike the issue of crime. The average person is facing increasing crime, has no real choices. Either they protect themselves or they're facing increasing crime. So they buy a gun or they get training or whatever. And the same thing with parents with poor schools, especially poor parents in these developing countries. But again, this progressive veneer, which has been the rationale for monopoly public schooling, which is controlled by the unions and so on and so forth, then develops an agenda, and which fits in with the progressive narrative, and the average person suffers from it. So one of the few positive things, we've talked about this before, that's come out of the COVID-19 shutdown is that many parents, especially many minority parents, poorer parents, can't afford elite schools. And so they've gone into homeschooling, they've tried pods, they've tried all sorts of other things because they can't handle the kids at home all day, and they want the kids to be educated.
Right.
And so James Tooley's
book, as opposed to
book,
merely indoctrinated, say.
right. So Tooley's book is sort of a rude awakening for a lot of people. Tooley's book is showing them a practical way out, that this is a universal issue, and the problems that you're facing can be addressed now. And look at the track record.
So speaking of self-help by owning your own gun and training and how to use it and so forth, a gentleman, an attorney who's long been associated with Independent, Stephen Halbrook, has a new book out, and maybe we should say just a moment something about that, because
Can you tell us the title of Stephen Halbrook's book, David?
Yeah, it's called The Right to Bear Arms, and which comes from the Second Amendment. The Supreme Court has accepted a case out of New York filed by some people who believe they have a right to carry. And Steve has done, in his usual incredibly meticulous way, the definitive work on the subject.
Right.
The
So
book,
his subtitle has, is this a right of the people, or is this just something, protection with firearms? Is that only something that the elite can have?
that's right, exactly.
And
So the book is on Amazon now, and it's #1 under the area of Constitution books. And Steve is the go-to guy on the subject. The court will be reviewing the case in a serious way in the fall. So there's going to be quite a buildup on this issue. And if the case goes based on Steve's work, Steve's analysis, this will essentially eliminate Biden's gun agenda, as well as the gun control measures in states and cities everywhere in the country.
The same author who's one of our senior fellows also was cited in a previous pivotal gun case. What was that, David?
Well, there are two cases. One was the Heller case that the decision was written by the late Antonin Scalia. And that was basically whether the federal government has the right to prohibit someone from owning a firearm. The second case was called the McDonald case, and that was a case also based on the Second Amendment, but also on the 14th Amendment, the Equal Protection Amendment, to say that states and local governments cannot prohibit you from owning a firearm. And those two cases are very powerful. The problem that occurred is that when Scalia died, the many cases that were brought against the city of Chicago and New York and other places based on the McDonald decision have never been examined. They've been rejected by the court, the Roberts Court. And so only now do we have a court that looks like it not only has accepted the case, but is open to looking at the issue in a serious way.
so I think we need to spend some time talking about today's dramatic development, where FBI went in on a search and seizure effort and took electronic equipment from the New York City apartment of Rudy Giuliani. I think all three of us probably have thoughts on this, and our listeners are probably quite interested in what.
Okay, give us just a little more thumbnail. What was the pretext, or the reason, at least, the justification?
Well, we think the reason is a law called the Foreign Agents Registration Act. So if you do a variety of things, including passing along information that's in the interests of a foreign power, I mean, a lot of us could be doing things like that, you have to register with the federal government.
If you do something that's in the interest of a foreign power.
Yeah. Obviously, if you're like directly employed by them to do
that's obvious.
Change legislation. But the thing is, we also have lobbying laws in the United States. We have anti-spying laws. This law, you may remember, this was what was used against Michael Flynn, who was President Trump's initial national security advisor. It's been used against lots of prominent, top-level Republicans and Democrats. Right after President Biden came into office, Senator Grassley, Republican senator, said that this law, the Foreign Agents Registration Act, should be used against Joe Biden and his son Hunter Biden. They were obviously agents of a foreign power. So it's possible that some Republicans will come to the realization from the Rudy Giuliani case, and possibly some Democrats, if somehow the Bidens get persecuted or prosecuted under this, they will realize that we don't really need this law. It came in during the President Franklin Roosevelt era. People were seeing German agents under, there really were hardly any German agents in the United States, but anyway, they were seeing them everywhere. And so this is not really a good
So
thing.
it sounds like the law is kind of a handy dandy all-purpose tool for people that you don't like, and you can prosecute them. Like, for example, like what if I published an op-ed or an essay or something saying that it would be a mistake to send bombers to Iran against their nuclear facilities? And of course, that's obviously in the interest of Iran, but I just think it's also smart not to send bombers into places. Then I could be accused under this law because I was serving the interests of.
Yeah, because the idea of agency is not agency. It's whether the idea is in sync with the views of that group. So, if you say, well, I'm against protectionist measures against China that supports China, therefore you could be prosecuted. And
it's a very vague and nebulous law.
Yeah.
And lots of people have been caught up in it. It's obviously overbroad. It's obviously over-inclusive. It obviously casts too wide a net. They should get rid of it. Now, the irony is that Rudy Giuliani became famous for using an overbroad law, which is the RICO statute, which was supposedly created in order to tackle the mafia. But he used it against all kinds of people, and many other prosecutors have used it against all kinds of other people. And it again, the law doesn't need these strange conspiracy provisions. It should go after overt acts, overt threats, planning of those threats, orders being given, and so forth. Those are all encompassed in the regular criminal law. And these super statutes that can drag in all kinds of people, Giuliani found it an attractive tool, and now a similarly nebulous thing is being used against him. So we're also seeing, of course, Trump is no longer in office, and our already, in my view, too politicized FBI and too politicized Department of Justice is now being used against the Trump people. So that's an unattractive feature. We really should stand for the rule of law, and not only should we be pruning some of these unnecessary or counterproductive or even evil laws, but we should be even-handed and neutral in the administration of justice and enforcement of law.
Laws should be specific, clear, and generally applicable, not vague and focused on people. And
and the bottom line was when the federal agents entered Giuliani's apartment and seized his electronic devices, that was a taking. They were not justified based on the fact that this Foreign Agency Act is not legitimate. It's unconstitutional, really.
Yeah, neither the states nor the federal government can take without due process of law.
Exactly, right.
Well, of course, the agents will say they had a warrant, but the point is they shouldn't have been able to get a warrant because this law should have been challenged long ago and gotten rid of.
We're coming near the end of our conversation today, but I just think it might be worth, and I'm directing this especially to David, just a final comment. I noticed in the Wall Street Journal a couple days ago, 3 days ago, that a top Obama scientist has reviewed a bunch of stuff on climate change and climate consensus, and apparently is bucking the so-called consensus narrative. Do you know anything about Stephen Koonin, David, or Bill?
Yeah, Koonin is a well-respected scientist. He worked with the Obama administration. He has a new book, which is challenging the sort of climate wokeness, climate alarmist hysteria, basically pointing out that the evidence does not support it. And he's directing it at pundits and policymakers, but also fellow scientists who are not standing up for the science. Now, we have a book, which is right over here in the bookshelf, called Hot Talk Cold Science, which goes into
I'm holding the book up so you can see what it is. Hot Talk Cold Science, Fred Singer and others.
Right, which has a similar theme, although Hot Talk Cold Science goes into far greater detail and has its own important history to it. But the point that Koonin is making is that the measures that Biden is pursuing and John Kerry wants and Greta Thunberg has fits over are completely unfounded. We just posted a new video by the Princeton physicist William Happer, in which he points out that there is really no climate crisis. And that's what the science says. The science is clearly saying that.
So Coonan also had an article excerpted from this book in the New York Post in the last week. And David is right in summarizing it. He's saying that, yes, there's probably some modest effect of human beings, but it's pretty modest. And it's certainly the origins, the causes of this are so complicated that we're in no position to be making important policy decisions on it. And, if you look at supposed heat waves or supposed hurricane things and all this stuff, it's no different from what it's been for many, many years.
That's right, for decades.
That's right. He documents this, and he says, look, this is not, I'm not telling you something that's some big secret. It's actually in there in all the reports of international agencies and American agencies. It's just that when you get it summarized by political scientists or by scientists who are involved in politics and by journalists, they don't comprehend it really, and he's trying to remedy that. So he was Undersecretary for Science in the U.S. Department of Energy during the Obama administration, as well as being a truly distinguished scientist in its own right.
And I think that if anything is the case, the evidence is stronger now against alarmism than it was even when the first edition of our book, Hot Talk Cold Science, came out, which is over 20 years ago. The humankind does have an effect on the environment, but you can't measure it. And there's so many complexities, as Bill is pointing out. To believe that you can control CO2, you can control the climate, is preposterous. It literally is preposterous.
I remember 40-some years ago, global cooling was a threat, allegedly, in all the newspapers and whatnot. Now it's global warming. But the amazing thing was that either way, there was a crisis, everyone was alarmed, and the solution was more government control of economic activity, internationally and nationally. It's always the default solution for the progressive mindset.
Well, and not only that, but
I actually knew a guy who wrote articles on the global claiming the global cooling thesis.
Well, yeah, and one of the interesting anecdotes to the story is that global warming was the mantra of the so-called hockey stick by Michael Mann and so forth, which is completely discredited. But one of the things that became an embarrassment was the fact that there was a pause in increasing temperatures from about 1997 for about 20 years. And none of the models could explain it. And so they changed the term from global warming to climate change is the problem. So again, it's a problem which does not exist, and the evidence does not show that there is a case for a crisis or an emergency.
We are grateful for everybody who follows us on this independent Outlook broadcast. As you can see, we do our best to keep on top of things and also to develop resources and research that can enable intelligent citizens to make their own decisions. We've mentioned our two books. You can see them behind my right shoulder, Really Good Schools, Hot Talk Cold Science. David mentioned another book, Right to Bear Arms, by our senior fellow, Stephen Hallbrook. We're doing our best to give you all
I could make one other thing, Graham.
Please.
There's another book on my shelf here called In All Fairness. We were talking about critical race theory and so forth, and this extreme egalitarian view, which is unfounded and is a danger. So that book is a critical look at the idea of egalitarianism and what it would mean and what's wrong with it. So I would also highly recommend that systematic book on the issue of equity, egalitarianism, and the ideas of liberty, which stand above it all.
Yeah, highly relevant. So anyway, as I say, please turn to us for resources, information. You can always find the latest at independent.org. Thank you to David Theroux.
Thank you.
And thank you to Bill Evers.
Thank you.
Thanks to our friends at ThinkSpot and around the country and even beyond who tune in for Independent Outlook. We will see you next time. Take care.